I want to welcome everybody to the Contra Costa Family Justice Center Family Justice Institute trainings. We offer a series of trainings throughout the year on various different topics. Today's training is going to be about interpersonal violence 101. As people are getting signed on here, it would be great to see where you're from. So please feel free to put your name and agency in the chat box. Just a reminder, Zoom courtesy, please make sure to have yourself muted. And let's go ahead and get started. We'll be able to ask questions throughout. So if you do want to ask any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll try and keep track of that throughout our time together. And then we have different sections we're going to go through. I'll get to questions at the end of each of those sessions. So as I said, this is Interpersonal Violence 101. And today we're going to be doing a couple different things. We're going to broadly define the definitions of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, elder abuse, human trafficking, and stalking. We're also going to identify safety risks, including lethality assessments, strangulation, and potential protective factors. We will also be introducing a public health approach as a means and a way of being able to prevent interpersonal violence, as well as we will also be looking at ACEs and the impact of trauma on children. All right. So I'm going to go in and let all the other folks here, and actually I'm going to do a housekeeping thing. Swastika, is that okay if I make you co-host so you can continue letting folks in for us? Thank you. Sorry, everybody. There we go. Okay. So as these topics are heavy, I just want to mention that, if you need to take care of yourself, turn your video off, you go ahead and do that. If you need to stand up at your desk, please feel free to do that. We're going to go for about an hour and a half. I won't be doing a break in between, so do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Okay, so in starting to talk about interpersonal violence, we have to start with talking about trauma and understanding what trauma is for folks. And I want to give a scenario. I want everybody to think about a time where you were in a tiny bit of a stressful situation, not really intense, something like you had a fender bender at a stop sign. And I want you to think about if you were in that fender bender and you got out of your car and somebody came up to you and started giving you all of these resources. You're not going to be able to internalize that, right? Because you just had this fender bender happen. So you're in a state of a little bit of crisis, a little bit of shock. You're not sure what to do. You want to make sure your car is okay. You don't want to listen to somebody else giving you all of this information. And there's actually a biological response that happens. So when folks are in crisis, when they've experienced a trauma, there's a physiological response that takes place. So the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain, is responsible for logic, for rationale, for putting things in a sequential order. But when you're in a fight or flight situation, what tends to happen is that part of your brain kind of takes a back seat. It says, I need to know if I need to freeze, flee, survive this situation. And the amygdala, which is sort of like in the middle, as you can see in this picture, that takes over. And that's what's called your reptilian brain. And that's where we've heard those fight, flight, or freeze things. And you can't control that. It's physiological. But what does happen then is if you're in that state, this prefrontal cortex, this I'm going to do X, Y, Z in this order, that rationale no longer happens because you're not absorbing information in the typical way that you would. And so a lot of times when we have clients come to the Family Justice Center or our partner agencies are working with survivors of trauma, it can be frustrating because they may not remember everything that happened to them. They may be very forgetful with appointments that they have with partner agencies, but that's because of a physiological response that's happening to them. And what tends to happen is the more trauma somebody encounters, if it's repeated over and over and over, your mind kind of gets stuck in that fight or flight mode. you can't really rely on your rationale and your thinking and processing factors because you are constantly worried that you're going to have to save yourself. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this towards the end of our presentation to sort of loop it all back. But I want to start with this understanding because trauma really impacts people in very different ways. Their response to trauma is different, but the physiological things that are happening elicit a very similar response. So a lot of people ask me, because I'm doing Interpersonal Violence 101, well, what is that? And in this context, it is domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, elder abuse, human trafficking, and stalking. So we're going to touch on each of these categories. This is a 101. So what that means is we're going to go in depth a tiny little bit in each of these categories, but we're not going to spend a lot of time in them. We do have other trainings in the Family Justice Institute series that go very in depth into human trafficking, domestic violence. And I would encourage you to visit our YouTube page where we have all of these trainings up on our website, totally free. You can go look at them, give them to colleagues. But for today's training, we're just going to do a brief overview. I'm going to go ahead and start with talking about domestic violence. Domestic violence is probably the most frequent type of abuse that we see in the Family Justice Center. About 75% of our clients are experiencing some type of domestic or family violence. So when we think about domestic violence, that is abuse in an intimate relationship. So what that means that there's a pattern of coercive behavior designed to exert power and control over another individual. When I say domestic violence, when you're thinking of these intimate relationships, you feel free to come off mute. What pops into your head when I say an intimate relationship? Or you can put it in the chat too, if that's easier. Yep, somebody who's married, dating relationship, yep. Someone who's close to you, someone you live with. Great, great. These are all exactly on the point. A family member, wonderful. So let's go to the next slide, because you're right. Intimate relationships are very specific relationships that are defined within the statutory code. So it is somebody you're married to, you were formerly married to, it's somebody you're dating or you used to date. There's also this category that's cohabitant or former cohabitant. So a lot of people think, oh, well, that means I am experiencing domestic violence if my roommate is abusing me somehow. And that's not quite the case. It has to be more than just you're living together and you're paying rent to the same body. So it has to be you have a shared bank account, or you used to have a shared bank account, you're on their insurance. There has to be more of a relationship or connection in there than just we're roommates, we live together. A co-parent, somebody that you have a child with, a child of either person, or another relative within the first or second degree. So when we think about degrees, we think about, okay, a parent, a grandparent, a child, a grandchild. If you are living with another family member, like an uncle or a cousin, that's within the category of intimate relationship as well. We actually had a client come in one time and say that they needed a restraining order against their great grandchild. That actually, in the definition, in the legal definition, isn't considered an intimate relationship, which was interesting. But so it's this very narrow body of people that you're most closely related to or have a relationship, a special relationship in some way with them. Okay, let's raise hands. How many people have seen the Power and Control Wheel? I know you have. Yep, I'm getting hands raised. Wonderful. Okay, so you already know this stuff. So the Power and Control Wheel is really a visual tool to help folks understand the different types of ways in which people can exert power and control over somebody else. So that can be physical violence, sexual violence, it can be emotional abuse, so verbal abuse. It can be economic abuse. A lot of times people don't think about financial abuse in the context of domestic violence. You know, if somebody's asking you or telling you that you have to deposit your paycheck into their bank account or into your joint account, that could be financial abuse. So any type of, there's spiritual abuse. A lot of times we also see individuals who use their children. You know, if you live in two separate homes and your child goes back and forth between that home, that's a body that somebody could use to try and abuse somebody else. So there's lots of different ways, but the main point is that that person that is causing harm is exerting power and control over another individual. And a lot of times what happens in those relationships is there's a cycle of violence that occurs. So usually at the start of a relationship, particularly a dating relationship, there's what's called the honeymoon phase. So you're happy, things are going okay. But if there's somebody that's causing harm in that relationship, at some point, there's going to be little indicators that they're trying to exert that power and control over you. So it's called the tension building phase. So that's usually where a lot of emotional abuse takes place. So yelling, swearing at somebody, sometimes gaslighting behavior, like, you know, if you go see your friends, you care more about your friends than you do me, that kind of stuff. And then at some point in that relationship, there's an explosion that happens. Now, the explosion can be physical, emotional, sexual, some kind, but that explosion happens, right? Right after that explosion, the person that has caused harm almost always goes right back into the honeymoon phase and apologetic phase. They're sorry for what they did. They don't want to do that to you know, the person that they're causing harm to. They want to be able to get the help. But if those two individuals in that relationship, if neither one changes their pattern of behavior, this cycle just continues and continues and continues. And in very severe domestic violence relationships, the honeymoon phase goes away at some point. It just is either tension building or explosion, tension building or explosion. So the only way to get out of that cycle is somebody, either one in that relationships, has to make a change. So what we hope for is that the person that is causing the harm gets help, right? They go to therapy. Maybe they have to do anger management. Maybe they need, you know, to exercise more because that helps them be calmer, whatever that looks like. But if that person doesn't make that change, that cycle doesn't change. What we see more frequently, though, is how to break this cycle is the person that has been harmed usually leaves the relationship. That's what we see most frequently. But at some point, somebody has to make a change, or else this cycle just continues and continues and continues. A little bit about statistics. How often does domestic violence happen between partners? It's roughly, there's various national statistics, but it's roughly 1 in 4 women, roughly 1 in 7 men will experience domestic violence within their relationships. And on average, a woman will attempt to leave an abusive relationship roughly 7 times before they actually leave that relationship for good. I use the gender term woman here because what we have seen, at least at the Family Justice Center, is about 85% of our clients are identified as female. We do see males who are being harmed, and we do absolutely provide services for individuals who don't identify as female, but for the most part, we tend to use a gender term of female when discussing domestic violence. So a lot of people always ask, well, gosh, if somebody's treating you that way, why don't you just leave? Right? That's a valid question. If somebody's harming you, you don't have to stay, especially if it's a marriage or a dating relationship, you don't have to stay there. But there's a lot of reasons why people don't. Some folks have a lack of support. They're on their own. And especially if somebody's been in an abusive relationship and they've been isolated for as long as they have, they may not have friends or family that they can turn to because they haven't been able to access those people in such a long time. Shame, being ashamed of the relationship status and where it's gotten to. The most common thing, especially in the Bay Area, is financial dependence on another person. Especially during COVID, what we were seeing is folks were staying in their relationships because it was a 2-income household. There was nothing else to rent anywhere else. Maybe if you have kids, trying to rent something with children on your own in the Bay Area, it's not feasible, right? We all know this. And so there's a lot of financial dependence that comes in that relationships that makes it more challenging to get out of. I'm not going to go through all of these, but obviously threats to harm, being isolated, immigration status, you know, you're going to out somebody as undocumented if they leave you, or they're going to take the children, you know, if you leave them. So there's lots of different reasons, but it's usually several of these. It's not just one reason. For Contra Costa County, at least in 2021, there were roughly 2,700 domestic violence police reports that were made by the 26 law enforcement agencies in Contra Costa County. What that means is that an officer responded to an incident, they actually took down a full report, and they filed that. That doesn't happen all the time when somebody responds to a domestic violence call. There's usually only a call history unless it's severe enough to become a police report. So the 2,700 that we're talking about is, 1, police have come to the scene, and 2, it's been bad enough that they've written a report. I tell you this because what that means is there are a whole host of other DV situations that are happening that are not captured in this data. So even though this was the yearly stat, you know, stat for 2021, there are more domestic violence incidents that are occurring. They're either just not being reported or they're not making it to a police report stage. Anybody have questions about that? I know that's a little. Okay. I also wanted to raise this red flag. We've been talking a lot about firearm safety recently. You know, we see a lot of mass shootings that happen throughout the United States. They happen on almost a daily basis. And what we know about those shootings is that over 50% of those cases, that individual that was the shooter, there was some type of family violence that had happened prior to that person had exerted on somebody else. So we're really trying to raise a red flag around domestic violence and family violence because we know this is an indicator of worse violence that can occur. More than 1/3 of the shootings that did take place involved a shooter that was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm. So what that means is they were either criminally prosecuted and they weren't allowed to have a firearm after their release. There was a restraining order placed against them and they were not allowed to have a firearm. I want to talk for a minute about danger assessments. And I do this because this is something that in Contra Costa County, our Domestic Violence Crisis Center and several of our police departments administer a danger assessment when they go out to the scene of a domestic violence call. It's a program that is called the Lethality Assessment Program, or we call it LAP for short. And it's an evidence-based homicide prevention tool. So several years ago, a woman named Dr. Jacqueline Campbell created a tool in partnership with the Maryland Network for Domestic Violence that was an indicator of if these things are happening in your relationship, you are more likely to be killed by your partner. And so there's 11 questions that they came up with. And it's questions like, has the person ever tried to choke you? Has the person ever tried to threatened to kill themselves? Has the person ever used a weapon against you? And the more answers you say yes to, if you're talking to a police officer, or you're talking to a domestic violence advocate, the higher risk you are of being killed by your partner. So in Contra Costa County, what we have is we have police departments, not all of them, because there's 26, but 4 police departments right now will administer and ask these 11 questions on scene. And then that officer then makes a phone call to the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, Stand for Families Free of Violence in Contra Costa County, and says, can I put you on the phone with this advocate in that moment? And the reason for that is because what we have found is that folks that have been killed in domestic violence homicides, only 4% of those individuals had ever made a connection to a domestic violence agency or services of some kind. But 50% of those who had interaction with the police were able to get connected when that connection started happening, when that phone call started taking place. So what we're trying to do is reduce the likelihood of somebody being killed by making that connection right away on the phone. As I mentioned, the LAP assessment asks a question about choking. So domestic violence and strangulation is very important, and it is a high-risk lethality marker that we look for. If somebody has been strangled by their partner, not to the point of being killed, but close to it, that increases your likelihood of being killed by 700%, which is a huge jump, right? So we have an entire protocol that the Family Justice Center follows. We've shared that protocol with different medical facilities like John Muir, Kaiser, Sutter Health, Contra Costa Regional Medical Center, because we all want the same response. If somebody says that they've been strangled by their partner, they need support. One, they definitely need to be seen by a doctor as soon as possible. But two, they're at risk for being killed. And so we need to create a safety plan around that to ensure their safety as much as possible. Again, I know this is a lot of heavy stuff. Please, please feel free to take care of yourself as I'm talking about this. But I also think it's really important for you all to know these things, because strangulation, danger assessments are not Contra Costa specific. They are statewide, they are national, and it's information that we all need to know about. Okay, before I move on to child abuse, does anybody have questions around domestic violence, the LAP program, statistics?
Natalie, there is one question in the chat. Is online human trafficking considered IPV?
It is. And when we get to the human trafficking section, we're going to go into that a little bit more. So great question. Okay, let's go ahead and move forward then. Okay, so child abuse, the definition of child abuse is when a person inflicts the following on somebody under the age of 18. So physical injury, sexual abuse of some kind, or being exploited, talking about the human trafficking, willful harming of an individual, a child, and what isn't necessarily considered in the domestic violence sphere, but is very specific for children, is if they are neglected or abandoned by their parent, that is also considered child abuse. And what we know statistically is that children who witness domestic violence, so even if they are not the recipient of abuse, if they witness it, they can suffer severe emotional and developmental difficulties similar to children who actually were the recipients of the abuse. So even just growing up in a household where no abuse was directed at you, it was directed at your other parent, but you saw that every day, that can elicit the same types of responses. So in Contra Costa County, our Children and Family Services, or CFS, in 2021, there were roughly 8,800 child maltreatments allegations that were made. Means that folks called in a mandated report, or somebody just called the hotline and said, hey, I'm concerned about our neighbor, whatever that looks like. This number is high, partly because if a child has interaction with a mandated reporter in several different ways, say, for example, they have an interaction with their teacher, and then the next week they have an interaction with their doctor, they go to a physical and they tell the same thing to their doctor, that doctor and the teacher are mandated reporters, and they have to share that abuse with CFS. So these are not, once cases are investigated, the number decreases significantly. It's about 1/8 of how many calls are actually called in, because a lot of times it's people calling in about the same child. Who's heard of ACEs before? Adverse childhood experiences. Hands. Yep. Okay, so I don't have to go over this. No, I'm just kidding. Adverse childhood experiences are experiences that we have when we are young that significantly impact our physical and mental health when we become adults. And there's three types of ACEs that researchers look at. They look at abuse, so whether it's physical, emotional, sexual. They looked at neglect, so if you're physically or emotionally being neglected as you're growing up, or if there's some other type of dysfunction within the household, if somebody you're living with has mental illness, if a relative of yours was incarcerated, if you saw your mother be treated violently, if there was substance abuse within the household, or if your parents ended up getting a separation or divorce when you were living in the household, that increases your ACEs score. And what that means is that individuals have a higher likelihood of mental, physical health indicators as they get older. They're sicker. They suffer from more diseases as they get older. They suffer from addiction more frequently. Premature death has even been linked to ACEs scores. And typically children that live within homes where violence is occurring, they tend to have more ACEs. So they tend to have more of these things checked off that, yes, I experienced this. Yes, I experienced this. So this is really overwhelming, right? Because as a child, you don't have a lot of control over how you are raised and what happens in your family, right? You're a kid. So the good thing about ACEs is there are factors to counteract that mental and emotional impact, physical impact that occurs. And these are called resiliency factors. So if you are able to form close relationships with caring adults, that reduces the likelihood that you're going to experience ACEs as you get older as an adult. If a caregiver has knowledge about what's going on and they use positive parenting skills around that, that decreases your likelihood of experiencing more traumatic things, more health indicators as you get older. If you have a sense of purpose, whatever that looks like, if you have opportunities to connect socially, you have a community around you that's supportive. Again, supportive services for your parents and the family you have as well is critical. And communities that value, that you're belonging to, that value people and promote healthy relationships and personal growth. These are all ways to combat the effects of ACEs. Again, super superficial overview, right? We're not going to get into the study. We're not going to get into this, details a little bit more, but I wanted to address this at least a little bit just to give people an understanding. Yes, and the PowerPoint will be emailed out after the training. Okay, jumping now to human trafficking. Okay, human trafficking occurs when someone deprives or violates the personal liberty of another with the intent to obtain forced labor or services. It does not necessarily involve somebody crossing a physical border or even holding somebody captive. So we have two different definitions of human trafficking that we actually work within. So we work with both clients that have been trafficked, labor trafficked, and trafficked sexually. So labor trafficking we see most frequently in domestic work, janitorial, caregiving, food services of some kind, massage businesses. This is where labor trafficking can occur. An example that I think folks have seen in the news or something is if there is somebody who acts as a nanny for a family and they're asked to work 12 hours a day, and then they also live in that home and they are not paid, or they are not paid the minimum wage plus overtime, because 8 hours a day is anything over that is overtime, right? That is labor trafficking. On the flip side of that, sex trafficking is something that I think the media brings up more frequently. I would say it's more When you think of human trafficking, that's the first thing you think of is, okay, sex trafficking. That's really in online dating and social media. That's actually how a lot of exploiters find their victims, is through social media. And it's seen in adult entertainment, strip clubs, hotels. We actually, unfortunately, also see this a lot in group homes, foster youth homes. A lot of exploitation occurs in those. And specifically, commercially sexually exploited children, or CSEC children, are children under the age of 18 who are sexually trafficked, who receive food and or shelter in exchange for, or being forced to paid to perform an act of some kind, and whose parent or guardian failed to protect that child. So CSEC cases do happen in Contra Costa County. They actually happen throughout the United States, but they happen here. There's a corridor within the Bay Area where a lot of exploiters work, and it's kind of along the port cities. So we see it a lot in Oakland, we see it a lot in Richmond, and we see it a lot in Vallejo. So it kind of goes up the East Bay. We also see it a lot in San Francisco as well. So the majority of the cases that we work with, especially in our high-risk review team for human trafficking, they're children under the age of 18, many of whom are in foster homes, have been removed from their home because of violence of some kind. And thinking back, that's an ACEs, right? If there's violence within your home, you're already going to be impacted. So what we know is that in children who are CSEC, usually have children welfare services involved in their home in some way. There is usually prior neglect that has occurred, or that they've experienced, and they've also been a part of the juvenile system of some kind, so juvenile criminal justice system of some kind. So we have a quick question. What would you say the largest subcategory of human trafficking? Would it be labor trafficking? You know, I don't know if you noticed, but I don't have a lot of statistics in these slides about human trafficking, and I did that on purpose. It is very difficult to collect data on how many survivors are being trafficked, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And there's several reasons for that. One is because oftentimes they don't actually know that the victim doesn't actually know that's what's happening. You know, when a client comes in to the Family Justice Center, it usually presents as domestic violence first. They usually say, well, my boyfriend is making me do X, Y, and Z, and I don't have access to my, you know, credit cards or my ID. He keeps those, and then I have to do things. Like, it never starts out with somebody walking in and saying, yep, I'm the victim of human trafficking, I need support. So typically it takes several conversations to make that revelation, because clients that are trafficked are very, very wary of people. They've experienced oftentimes several different, you know, traumatic events, and they're in that trauma state all the time. They're in fight or flight mode, right? They're just trying to survive the experience they're going through. So I don't actually know the answer to the question that was posed in the chat, because there is not great data on how many individuals are trafficked sexually and how many individuals are trafficked labor in the labor field as well. Some key indicators of the types of trafficking that we see in sex trafficking, we see a lot of like branding or victims will get tattoos of a mark of their exploiter. There's always slang that is used. What we tend to look for specifically is if a youth has a lot of new, really expensive clothing or very expensive tech gadgets or a new, very expensive purse, things that they wouldn't have the money to be able to get that stuff. So where is it coming from, right? They usually have multiple cell phones. They also usually have multiple social media accounts. And Instagram is the biggest indicator being used by exploiters and being used by those that are working in sex trafficking. Labor trafficking, as I mentioned before, they're usually not in control of their money. They're usually not in control of their own, like, identifying documents, their social security card, their driver's license. They usually owe a very large debt to somebody, and that exploiter holds that over their heads. What we see in both types of trafficking, though, is there's a very prescriptive movements that they can make. They don't get to go somewhere where somebody doesn't know where they're going. They don't usually get to talk on their own behalf. There's usually a lot of confusion around where they are. They're paid terribly, and there's usually no personal possessions that they have. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of distrust, hypervigilance, stuck in that fight or flight mode, just trying to survive. We see that a lot in both victims of labor and sex trafficking. I think that's my questions on human trafficking. Okay, and you shoot them in the chat if you have one in 10 minutes. That's perfectly okay to do too. Okay, so we're going to talk about rape and sexual intercourse, or excuse me, sexual assault. There are two distinct categories. So I'm going to start with rape because it's actually the narrowest category. And it is sexual intercourse without consent. And so an individual cannot consent when there's a lack of capacity to do so, when they are intoxicated, or unconscious, unaware of what's happening to them. They consent out of fear or because of a threat, right? Or in California, if you are under the age of 18, the law says you cannot consent to sex. Even if you are active and willing participant, you legally cannot consent to a sexual act. Statistics, it's roughly 1 in 6 women that have experienced an attempted or completed rape, about 1 in every 33 men. These are from the Rape and Incest National Network. So these are very much global picture, or United States. In Contra Costa County, as I mentioned, the same stats, the rapes that were reported by police, there was about 252 in 2021. So that gives an idea. I think there is significantly more sexual assaults and rapes that take place that are they're not reported. Okay, so rape is a very narrow category. It has a very narrow definition. It's talking about sexual intercourse without consent. Sexual assault is a broader category. It encompasses more sexual acts that are non-consensual. So that can include sodomy, oral copulation, penetration of some kind, or even a sexual touching that's not consensual. And again, it's the same thing we're looking at. It's not consensual because they cannot give consent. It's under a threat of violence, or it's being forced. Any one of those, that is a type of sexual assault. Some statistics around survivors of sexual assault and some of the trauma that they experience after the sexual assault takes place. So the likelihood that a person suffers suicidal or depressive thoughts significantly increases after they've experienced that sexual violence. Roughly 94% of women who are raped have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, at least within the 2 weeks following the incident. And 30% of women experience those same symptoms even 9 months after the incident that takes place. Also, 33% of women who have been raped have contemplated suicide, and 13% of those actually did make an attempt. Okay, questions about sexual assault, rape, definitions? We do work with sexual assault survivors at the Family Justice Center. We also work really closely with our partner organization, Community Violence Solutions. They're the Sexual Assault Crisis Center for Contra Costa County. It is similarly to human trafficking. It is very hard to gauge outside of that, this statistic, how many sexual assaults actually take place. because so many of them are not reported. Okay. Moving on to stalking. So stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to experience fear. So a reasonable person is a legal term of art. So it is not that they made you experience fear. It is that if a reasonable person in that same situation would experience fear, then that would be considered stalking. So that's a little bit of a finesse around the legal definition. And just some stalking facts, it's roughly estimated about 13.5 million people are stalked in a 1-year period in the United States. Nearly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men have experienced stalking at some point during their lifetime. And I'm going to give you an example of what we see at the Family Justice Center. We work with stalking survivors, and a stalking survivor always comes in and starts the conversation. I know you're going to think I sound crazy, but, and then they fill in with, their story. So what happens is, and especially with social media, everything has become so much worse, is that they get calls all the time from somebody. We've had clients where we've been sitting in a room with them, and I had somebody call in a half-hour period 45 times. And she just kept putting it on silent, kept ignoring it. 45 times. Right? So unwanted phone calls. They also call from spoof phone numbers that aren't traceable, which makes it really tricky. Online surveillance. So, it's great when we have Instagram and Facebook because we can tag where we are. Like, we're out to dinner at a really fancy restaurant. That's great, except if you're concerned that somebody's stalking you, now they know where you are. And so that's what happens is we tend to find that they're able to use like the Find My Phone app on somebody else. We have had people who have had trackers placed on their cars. And we had a presentation a couple of years ago from a forensic investigator with the district attorney's office who does all of the tech abuse that happens. He said trackers are like this small. You can buy them on Amazon. They're this small and they are impossible to find on a car. So what we always tell clients, if they've come in and they say, I'm almost positive I have a tracker on my car, the first thing we do is tell them, go to a body shop, have them put it on a lift and see if you can see anything. And if you do see something, call the police. But they're so tiny that they're really easy to miss. And even when folks, if they have a phone number that somebody's been calling over and over and over, we tell people to get a new phone, but we tell them, do not link it to your old phone. You cannot use the cloud to put anything else in that phone, because it's basically you're replicating that phone, right? So if you're using the same cloud system, that person's going to be able to find that information still. So these come in fairly frequently, I would say. Usually it's in the context of a former dating relationship that's now broken up and a person is causing harm by stalking them. We have had clients that have come in where they have found trackers in their children's stuffed animals before. For surveillance, it's very difficult to prove these cases too, especially in the Bay Area. People are very tech savvy, right? So they know ways of being able to get into your computer, email, that kind of stuff. So it gets really complicated. And yes, all police departments are trained in stalking. I say that with the caveat that not all of our criminal justice process has caught up to the tech revolution that we're in. So a lot of times, if it's a complex case of stalking via the internet and like using different VPNs and getting into all that, police departments aren't necessarily going to know how to handle that. They're still going to be able to take a report, not saying they won't, but you usually have to have an expert. So the DA's office has an expert. A lot of times they tell folks, go to Apple and try and figure out a log of where you're getting these pings from if somebody's pinging your phone. So it's, unfortunately, tech has just evolved so fast that it hasn't necessarily caught up with like judges and prosecutors. So it is a lot of legwork, unfortunately, on the part of a stalking survivor to sort of gather that information and then present it to the police and say, this is my proof I am being stalked, I need assistance, or if they're wanting a restraining order of some kind. Okay, moving on. Questions about stalking? Okay. Okay, so elder abuse, we work with elder abuse survivors in the family justice centers. And elder abuse, as you can imagine, is committing an act on somebody who is an elder, which in California, that is defined as 65 years or older, or a dependent adult. So what that means is if you are between the ages of 18 and 64, and you do not have the capacity to make your own decisions, and somebody makes decisions on your behalf, that is also considered elder abuse, or it's kind of wrapped up in that category. It happens a lot when somebody willfully or causes an elder or dependent adult to suffer physically or mentally. The most frequent type of elder abuse that we see is financial abuse. It's usually an adult child of a victim who is in charge of their finances. Maybe they have power of attorney, something like that, and they're using those finances not in a way that is meant that it should be for the elder. Also false imprisonment. And what we also see too is if you are legally responsible to care for somebody, an elder dependent adult, neglect can come in as a type of elder abuse. So there is a domestic, there is a wheel, power and control wheel around elder abuse specifically. There's also one for teenagers, if you ever need to Google that. But again, the main point here is it's almost always a family member that is abusing the elder, and it's usually financial abuse. It is also a lot of gaslighting, so a lot of manipulation of not only the elder individual, but also the other family members, making the elder look crazy or making the elder look incompetent, so that they should not have access to their finances. They should not be able to make legal decisions on their own behalf. So it's a little bit of both that we see that play out. How often does elder abuse happen within Contra Costa County? At least in 2021, there were about 5,600 elder abuse reports made to Adult Protective Services. And I apologize that the statistics are a couple years old. I'm hoping we're going to be able to get 2022 statistics. They usually don't come out until the middle of 2023 because folks have to usually report them to like the DOJ, and that takes time to collect. So I know these are a couple years old, but they've been roughly around the same 5,000 mark for a couple years now. This is actually what is happening within Contra Costa County. This is from the Employment and Human Services Department dashboard that you can access if you just put Contra Costa County Employment Human Services dashboard. This will give some of the information around all the different types of public benefits, how many folks in the county are on what public benefits, and then it also talks about elder abuse. So as you can see here, the highest types of elder abuse that are reported are financial exploitation and also self-neglect. That's very unique to elder abuse. If somebody is very neglectful of their own being, if they're over the age of 65, that can be reported as like a mandated report to Adult Protective Services, and they can have a social worker go out and check on that individual. A lot of times we see that in conjunction with hoarding situations. Folks just have a ton of stuff in their homes. Usually they're not great at caring for themselves, so they try and have a social worker come out. The difference though is if you report something like that when it's a child, the child can be removed from the home if needed or if necessary. If it's reported when you're an adult, the most the social worker can do is offer resources. We can't take somebody out of their home if they're an adult and their capacity is there. All we can do is sort of say, hey, we see this, we want to support you. Here's some ways that you can get some help. But if that person does not want to be helped, there's not a lot that we can do to force them. Okay, so pausing here for a minute, that is a very brief overview of IPV in a nutshell. As I mentioned before, each of these categories we try and really focus on in our Family Justice Institute series that we do. But the next categories I want to talk about is what working with survivors looks like. And a lot of you, the majority of you are direct service providers. So you probably have encountered folks that are survivors of some type of interpersonal violence. So the first thing I always try and focus on is looking at when somebody comes into the office, looking at what their risk factors are. So we mentioned that in the context of domestic violence, that if a client comes in and they start telling me, well, he's starting to harm himself, they just lost their job, he choked me, 2 months ago, my red flags are going to be like pinging all over the place. This person is now, it's beyond just, it's not just domestic violence, is I'm concerned this person is going to be killed by their partner. So it's really important to know those risk factors and know to be able how to identify them so that we can get extra support around that survivor. Similarly, child abuse, if there's domestic violence that is taking place in the home, I mean, just witnessing domestic violence is a type of child abuse, but that child could also be the recipient of abuse. We do see that a lot in low-income households. We also see that with children who exhibit challenging behaviors because there's a lot of stress around that, right? If a child has a developmental delay, that is very stressful for the family as a whole. It's stressful for the client too. And not everybody reacts to that. Some people are great. They're able to handle it. They got control, but some people cannot handle that. And so that increases the likelihood that that child might be abused in some capacity. For human trafficking, under the age of 18, there was Children and Family Services involvement. There was at some point. Whether the child was removed from the home or not, that's where we see it almost always. And also if there's some type of family or domestic violence within the home, that increases your risk. What we have seen too is that adults who are traffickers will traffic their family members. And it's horrible, but we do see that happening. So it is very internal and very, it's passed down through it's generational violence that is occurring. Sexual assault, if you're already in a relationship with somebody who is abusive to some capacity, that increases your risk of having sexual violence happen to you as well. When there's lots of drug and alcohol use that take place, that makes you incapacitated or more likely to not be able to make decisions on your own. The consent aspect isn't there. So that's something else that we ask about and try and look for. The good thing is we also try and look at protective factors that folks have. So within every survivor that comes into our office, we're asking them, what do you have at your fingertips that can help with this situation right now? Do you have other supportive family members that you can go to? Let's say, for example, if your spouse is being abusive towards you, do you have a sister you can go stay with? Do you have a community that you can rely on? A lot of times that's a faith-based or church community that folks will rely on for support. Do you have a network or education that allows you to make those connections happen? So for example, if somebody comes into the Family Justice Center, we have 64 partners that we work with. And so the goal is to try and connect that individual to as many of those partners as possible to get those supportive services. Not everybody has access to the Family Justice Center though, right? In very small towns, you're not gonna have access to the DV agency that's in lots of different places within the county. There may only be one that may be really far away and it may be hard to access. So we really try and have conversations around where somebody is at in their life and who they have to rely on if they need to exit a situation. When looking at what a survivor needs, we look at a ton of stuff. This is not a comprehensive list. I don't even know if a comprehensive list could be made. Every client that we work with has something different that they're needing assistance with. And even if 2 different clients are looking for housing, each of those situations is going to be different because their income is going to be different. Whether they're fleeing domestic violence or whether they've been out of a domestic violence relationship for several years is different. So we try and touch on these topics as much as possible to see what services folks are needing, but we also know that everybody's situation is unique. So why a family justice center? So the Family Justice Center started in 2011 in this county. Family Justice Centers actually started in the early 2000s down in San Diego. It's called the Alliance for Hope. And the Alliance for Hope is now sort of like the head for all the other family justice centers. And there's 26 family justice centers throughout California. And the reason that Contra Costa wanted to have a family justice center is because what folks were experiencing was something like this. There was a client who was needing services, and let's say they had police respond out to their home this past weekend and they needed help. Well, the police department's going to give them an envelope with a bunch of different phone numbers and information on how to get assistance for a restraining order or create a safety plan. That person then has to go of their own accord, right, and try and find those resources. So the person has to drive to the courthouse, which is in Martinez, to get the restraining order paperwork, fill it out, file it. They have to go back the next day to pick up the restraining order paperwork, take it over to the sheriff's office that is down the road, and have the sheriff's office serve that person. And maybe at the courthouse or at the sheriff's office, the clerk says, a really good resource would be the Domestic Violence Crisis Center for the county, right? Well, that's not located in Martinez, that's located in Concord. And so then they have to drive to Concord, and you see where this is going, right? And in the beginning of this presentation, I was talking about folks that are in trauma states do not have the mental or physiological capacity to do those things in a sequential order or retain that information. And so it becomes extremely overwhelming. And even though there are a number of wonderful resources within Contra Costa County, if the system presents itself like this, if you have to drag your kids with you to go to the courthouse and then go to sign up for public benefits, that takes time, that takes energy. If English is not your first language, everything becomes exponentially harder right then, right? And so we had a system that looked like this. And so what the Board of Supervisors in conjunction with the county said is, we need to change that. We need a model that looks like this. And that's when the Family Justice Center was created. And the Family Justice Center really focuses their services around the victim. And the way we do that is we have all of those partner agencies that folks are referring you to and all these different arrows in one place. Think about that. You experience a trauma and you can go to one spot to get connected to all these different resources that are going to be able to help you. So we work a lot of times with clients that are in crisis. Usually something happens the night before or the week before, and they need all of these things. They need case management. They need to file for victim compensation. They need to file for a restraining order. They want to talk to somebody about how to stay safe in their home. All of these things we want to be able to provide in one location so that that person is more likely to get those services. If you go to one spot, you can connect with 3 different people, somebody that can do a restraining order for you, somebody that can sign you up for public benefits in the same building, you're going to access those services. You're actually going to connect, right? And we also try and stick with our clients longer term. So in this outer circle, you're seeing this long-term safety. And what we look at is in order to be self-sufficient and to not have interpersonal violence, you need four categories. You need to have health. You need to have some type of community, whatever that looks like for that person. You need to have wealth. It doesn't have to be a lot, but you have to have something, right? And you need to have some type of education and training. And when you have all of those four factors, that decreases the likelihood that you're going to experience interpersonal violence. It doesn't eliminate it, but our theory is it helps decrease it. And so what we really try and focus on is we stick with our clients long-term. So after their crisis state, we try and have as many programs as possible in these four categories. So we offer yoga, which Swastika coordinates, for families. We offer parenting classes. We also offer monthly group get-togethers, to get that sense of community. So there's several different ways in which we want to be able to support clients long-term. Questions about the structure of the Family Justice Center, or even, protective factors, risk factors to look for?
Natalie, there is a
Yes.
question. I wasn't sure if it was answered. Sylvia writes, is RPD trained in stalking? If RPD is trained to deal with stalking, and what if stalker violates the restraining order?
They are. So each law enforcement agency has been trained in stalking. They also have been trained in violations of restraining orders. What I will say, and this is the very legal response, and I apologize, every situation is different. So if somebody has a restraining order against somebody else, and they both happen to show up at the same Safeway, but it's not stalking, it's like a coincidence, that may not be taken as a violation of the restraining order, versus if the person who has the restraining order against them comes to the house of that victim, right, and then actively tries to violate the restraining order, that's going to be a different situation. So it's very situational, but there is a stalking component to be able to have a violation actually filed with the DA's office and criminal charges are pressed. So stalking is a big component of showing that there's a pattern of behavior that warrants a violation of a restraining order. Does that make sense? I see two people nodding, so I'm going to go with those two people. Okay, let me come back here. Okay, so we've seen what the fractured system looks like. We've seen why a Family Justice Center. So the one thing I always tell people when I'm doing these presentations is you all, especially as service providers, are going to see so many more people than I'm ever going to be able to reach out to. I'm going to do these presentations for as long as I possibly can, but I'm not going to be able to reach everybody in our community. But all of us as a collective are going to be able to reach a pretty significant amount of people. And so what I always ask people to do is tell somebody about what you heard about today, whether that's your partner, whether that's a friend you're going to have coffee with tomorrow. Tell them. And the reason for that is because given the statistics that we've seen throughout this presentation, we know that there's so many people that are suffering from interpersonal violence of some kind. And if you, as a holder of knowledge now, know what resources to be able to direct that person to, or to even be able to identify what it is, you may be able to get somebody help. And I'm going to give you an example. We partner closely with the George Miller Wellness Center. They send a lot of clients over to us. And there is a psychologist that works there that took our Human Trafficking 101 training several years ago, prior to COVID, a long time ago, right? A year ago, she shot me an email and she said, I want to run a case by you because I think this is human trafficking. And what I remember from the presentation was, and then she went on to tell me what it was. And because of that presentation, she was able to identify that patient that she was working with was a victim of human trafficking. And she was able to connect that victim to those supportive services because of what she remembered from these trainings. So I know I went through all of these categories very, very quickly. And they can go everyone can go in depth a little bit more, but if you can take away some nuggets from today, you might be able to help support somebody, whether it's a friend, a family member, or a client that you're working with, and let them know about the resources that are available. I also encourage people to visit our website, cocojustice.familyjustice.org. You're welcome to do that anytime. And I am open. I guess we're ending a little bit early, but I'm open to answering any questions folks might have. That is my email. I do check my emails all the time, so please feel free to email me if you have follow-up questions about specific situations. We will be sending out the slides from today, and we'll also send out an evaluation for today. Please, it takes 2 minutes. Please fill that out. I look at every single one, and I love if you have great comments, but what I really love is if you have constructive comments, right? Because I want to make these trainings as relevant as possible to everybody else who's sitting in on them. And I can only do that if I get the feedback from you, if something's not feeling great or I need to change something. So are there any questions that folks might have? And feel free to come off mute if you want to. I have been talking at you for a very long time. Nothing? All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, for donating a little bit of your time today with me. You get 20 minutes back, so I hope you're able to do something healthy and relaxing during that time. But thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great, great rest of your weekend. All right, take care, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Miss you guys over there.
Hi, it's so nice to see you.
Yes, I haven't seen you in so long. When I get the emails from Martha, I'm like, oh, I gotta come check you guys out sometime.
I'm so glad you did.
Yes, I'm at the county now in Antioch. I work